All right. Welcome, everybody. Today, I am so excited because, these insider tracks have been so successful. And this is our second one. The last one was great. You guys love it. So thank you. And this week's guest is Sade Rael, who I'm not even sure how the two of us met. I think she was on my podcast first. Maybe I creeped on her on Instagram. I'm not entirely sure, but anyhow, absolutely love her and love everything that she is doing for podcasters. Now, if you're not a podcaster, that's okay, because today she's going to tell you how to at least use podcasts as a podcaster or as a guest to scale in your business. So, Sade is a top 200 podcaster, experienced entrepreneur with over 11 years experience and a dedicated visibility mentor. She's the host of Feel Good Naked and her first 3 years podcast. As the founder of Podcast Alchemy, she empowers women to raise their voices and boost their professional confidence, helping them shine brightly in their industries. With a passion for building deeper connections, Sade coaches entrepreneurs to become thought leaders with meaningful communities. I am super excited to introduce to you Sade. Sade, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. And we did meet on a podcast. It was yours. So
Was
it
it
makes it
mine? Okay.
even more relevant. Yeah. And then you came on mine. So it's just the gold of podcasting. It keeps
It
giving.
absolutely is. I actually, you might laugh at this, but I have in my email, right? I use the folders to keep everybody organized. And I have a tribe folder. And Sade, you are in like under the tribe. So you're a subcategory. Like,
I feel honored. I feel honored. Thank you.
you are welcome. I'm going to turn it over to you for today's Insider Track.
Amazing. So I am going to try to make this as actionable as possible for everyone who's joining live or you watch the replay. If you are here live and something does jot into your mind, please don't wait for me to open for questions. Just like pop it in the chat and I will look at it. I won't call it your name or anything. Don't worry. But just so we can make it super relevant to you. What I want to do here is the title is Podcast Magic, and it really is about the magic side of podcasting because I think in the past, a lot of us have thought of it as it's kind of like NPR or it's like Joe Rogan. It's like those two extremes. It's either really crazy comedy or maybe it's true crime or it's all about very serious society and culture. And it's only in the last, I would say, 5 to 7 years that that has totally changed. And a big reason why it's changed is that so many more people are listening to shows. So there's something like 500 million podcast listeners, but there's only 4 million shows. And that's a really interesting thing I want you to remember as we go throughout this little session, because I am going to tell you about the opportunity, about how to stand out and how to connect with those audiences. But I also want you to remember that because the market is actually not that big, but there's a lot of demand, there's so much opportunity, whether that's the case of you want to start a show, it's not as competitive as you think. There's like 2 billion Instagram accounts. So when I mentioned that, people are like, oh, 4 million shows, 2 billion Instagram accounts. It's a different, playing field. It's a little bit easier in podcasting when you know what to do. And then on the other side of that is if you decide that you want to be a guest, it's about being very careful about the shows that you do choose to go on because they are not all the same. I mean, some of the ones that exist to this day are really good, but other ones, it's just because like sheer perseverance. The person's not going to stop. So I want to help you be able to differentiate on both of those. So again, these are strategies for you, whether you want to start a show, you have a show, or you just want to be on a show to grow your business. And when we start with opportunity, so first thing, opportunity. Second thing, how do you stand out? And then third thing, how do you connect with the audience to grow, to scale your business? When we talk about the opportunity, it's a weird thing right now where I always say how 2012, it was all about Facebook. You wanted to be there. That's where you would build your business. And then 2018 was Instagram. And then 2021 was TikTok, right? Everybody wants to be on TikTok. And now the question is, okay, where do you go in 2025? And there's not a really clear answer in terms of a platform, but something that is super clear and people show again and again is they want to connect deeper. They want to actually know the person. They want to know their brand. They don't want to just see a polished, perfect photo anymore. I mean, that's why Reels are doing so much better on Instagram. They want to have more understanding of who you are, even if it's your business and you're not the face of it, what your business represents. And on the other side of that, they really want to also be offline. And most of us are running our business online, or we're at least trying to tap that market. And so it's a big struggle of, well, how do I grow an online community with people who are increasingly trying to find joy and fulfillment and happiness offline? And that's where podcasting comes in. Because most podcasts, when people listen to them, I don't know, for some of you, you might have a quick answer of like where you listen to them. Probably some of you, it's getting ready. Some of you, it's, on your commute. Other people, it might just be while you're brushing your teeth or you're cooking a meal, but it's always often when you are just relaxed and doing something else, which is often not in front of a screen. So it's this magic opportunity where you can get your voice in front of people when they are in a calm, nervous system regulated, for all my wellness people out there, situation. And they are more receptive to what you say. Podcast listeners also tend to be more loyal. So they will continually spend around 3 to 5 hours per week listening to the episodes that their favorite shows put out. And that doesn't necessarily just mean the most recent episode. This is also something where, when I talk about the opportunity that we forget, is in a world where you post and it's gone the next week, with podcasting, it lives on. So someone might listen to their favorite show and you're on it, and then they find your episode because you very carefully talked about what they care about, which that will be the section 3 we talk about here. And so they find this episode you did on someone's interview or your own show 6 months later. So it's this interesting place of allows people to be offline, allows people to feel like they're actually doing something positive. Nobody feels positive when they're scrolling through their social media, right? And it also is these really engaged people who want to hear from you. They also tend to be very likely to buy. So Spotify puts out a trends report every year. And the most recent one, I think it showed 56% of listeners are likely to buy from their favorite shows. So if you're on that show, it's a lot easier to build your brand, to show stuff. Or if you have the show, you can obviously pitch your own stuff. But this is where we get into the difficult part, because it sounds great, right? You're like, oh, such a good opportunity. Why is everybody not doing this? Or maybe you have done it and it didn't work out well for you. Maybe your show, no one really listened, or you went on a show and no one really found you. And that, unfortunately, is a side of it, because as much opportunity as there is, there's also some strategy that comes in terms of how do you stand out, whether you're creating a show or you're being a guest on a really good show. For me, I will say that it took me, I've now been 5 years in the podcasting world. It took me about a year and a half to figure this out, because I was quite honestly like, had no idea, just trapezing along, talking about the stuff I liked. If someone invited me on a podcast, I'd say yes. I would just, put myself out there. And I think there's a lot of value in that, especially in the beginning. But it's not what's going to grow your show, grow your brand, or get you in front of necessarily the right people. So this is the first sticky point. You got the opportunity, but how do you actually stand out? How do you, one, stand out if you create a show, but two, stand out if you're on a show? Because you could go on the best show in the world, but if you don't actually know how to position what you do, you don't know how to make it sound interesting, you don't have the right stories, then that might not really connect with the audience in the same way. And I think a really big mistake or myth people have related to this is that it's about the size of the audience, and it's not. So you could have a tiny podcast that you run, and you could have regular sales coming from it because you have really narrowed in your positioning. You understand your people, you understand what they need. We'll talk a little bit about that today. And so they keep coming back to you. That is more valuable than people who are just randomly finding you because you have a huge Instagram community and they listen once and never come back. On the same part of this, I've been a guest on tiny shows. We're talking about 50 listeners a month, to shows which are in the top 1% of all that exist. And I have seen that it's not necessarily the audience size that brings me more people to connect with me or buy from me. It comes down to how well I position on that show and also how well I identified the right audience, that I was on the right one. So let's first talk about that idea of like, how do you position yourself? How do you stand out? How do you identify? The one thing I always kind of teach my people, because I have two programs I run, and one of them is how do you start a podcast, and the other is how do you get on it. But on both of those, we always start with this idea called Nook. And Deanna might know this idea. But the Nook is it takes your niche a little bit deeper and it's specifically oriented for podcasting. So Nook is NOOK. And if you think about a nook, it's this tiny corner of your house or apartment that you just love. It's the one with the sunlight, has the plants, maybe it has your favorite pillows, it has the window. In every single room that exists, everyone has a nook, like a place they like to be. And when you are in podcasting, whether you're creating a show or you're on a show, you want to figure out how can I create this nook for my listeners? And I have to do it in an auditory way, right? Because they're not necessarily seeing me. I mean, there's more video now on podcasts, which we can talk about later, but primarily it's audio. So, how do I create this feeling of acceptance and warmth? And I just want to sit in that place and I want to bask there like a cat. Nook, again, is that visual, but it's also an acronym. So, NOOK. N is non-negotiable. So non-negotiable are going to be the 1 to 3 things that you refuse to let people compromise on when they work with you or buy from your brand. These are the things that they must absolutely have to do. So if you're a declutter specialist, your big thing is like you have to go through the clothes that you never wear and you have to get rid of X amount, right? Like these are the things that you just will not compromise on. They are important because they gravitate listeners towards you, where people are like, oh, yeah, I want to do that. But they also repel people. And I know that can be a little scary, but in podcasting, as in anything, when building your brand, like you have to be okay to repel some people in order to attract the ones that really are going to connect with you. And the way to figure out if you're really in your nook is if you are getting a few people that are repelled, you're losing some followers, some people are commenting, not necessarily trolls, but like they're, not everyone loves you. That's a really good indication of, okay, I am, and it's scary. I know I didn't like this either, especially coming from corporate where we want to make sure everyone's happy. But it's a non-negotiable. So thinking about maybe now or after this, what are your 1 to 3 non-negotiables that you insist someone do to work with you or your brand? And those things might be a little controversial for some. Then we have O. O is your objective. So O is observations. I was getting ahead of myself. O is observations. And this is things you notice that your ideal client does. Their patterns, the things that you see them do again and again. So, for example, when I started my podcast, her first 3 years, it's for entrepreneurs. And I looked at what do I see people doing again and again that I know is hurting them or not helping them get ahead. And a big one was they are spending all their time on content creation instead of strategy. And so knowing that behavior, knowing that observation, I can then create a podcast episode about it. I can create a post about it. I can pitch that idea to another show, which I know has my ideal audience, because I know people do this. And so it immediately establishes, okay, she understands me. She knows what I don't want to do anymore. And maybe I want to listen a little bit deeper. So, thinking about, again, as with the non negotiables, what are the 1 to 3 patterns you see again and again in your clients or your customers, things that they do that don't necessarily help them, or in fact, maybe sabotage them as well? Then we move into the outcome. So, outcome is the second O. Outcome is going to be, what is the non-sexy version of what you do to help people? Basically, like in technical terms, how do you help them? When I was a nutritionist, I helped people figure out what meal plans worked for them. Like, it's not a very exciting thing to say, but it's the outcome. This outcome is more for you. It's not actually something that you necessarily talk about directly. That will be the next piece that we have in a second. But the outcome is just for you to truly understand, like, what do I create for these people? And it doesn't even have to just be your whole business. It can be a new product that you create. What is the outcome that I'm creating here? And we know this, right? Like, we're told this again and again, but we don't often use that for storytelling, which is what podcasting essentially is. It's a conversation meets storytelling. So, thinking about, what are the outcomes that I bring for people, and then I can use that to also influence what episodes I create. I can also use that to pitch myself on shows that I want to go on. I can very specifically say, this is what I do. But the next step we want to do first is, you want to make it sound sexy. Because again, if I just told people, oh, I make a meal plan to help you with your health, it doesn't sell. Nobody wants to buy that thing. The kicker is the K. So that's the last part of Nook. The kicker is, how do you get someone to take your outcome, to hear it and say, I want that. I can't imagine not having that. Because when you reframe this way with your kicker, that's how you get on a great podcast show. Because you say, hey, here's what I do with a kicker. And the host thinks, my people would love that. Because as hosts, we're always searching for guests. It's just a matter of, can you convince us in a great way? It's really what it comes down to. So the kicker is, how do I reframe the outcome, the transformation, into something that sounds really sexy? And you might need to think about this a little bit, but you'll know when you've hit it, because it's the thing where you talk to someone about it. You can talk to friends, peers, clients, and say, what do you think about this? So, as an example, for me, when I was starting my first podcast, it was going to be something like wellness for women, which is super generic. I mean, it's the outcome, right? I help with that. But I knew that that wasn't something that people say, oh, hands up, I want that. So instead, I really thought about, how can I make this something that people stop in their tracks and say, I want that. And I came up with Feel Good Naked. And that encapsulated everything that I talked about, because I didn't want my show to just be about, I didn't want it to be about diets. I didn't want it to be about looks. I wanted it to be about like true confidence and health, deep, deep, deep. And I knew I hit it in the head when I had asked clients and friends, and I said, hey, I'm thinking about this show called Feel Good Naked. And everyone's eyes were like, yeah, that sounds good, because it's catchy. Everyone wants it. And it just sticks in your mind. And then I could use that to be on multiple shows. There are so many shows I've been on where the topic is Sade Royale, how to feel good naked. You could probably Google it and you'll come up with like 5 or 6, because people wanted it. So you can take anything you do, even if you think it's the most boring thing in the world, and you can find a way to transform it when you think about your Nook and when you think about the kicker. And the kicker is going to be the thing that really creates your show and that really creates the pitch that you send to a podcast to be on it. So that's the Nook. This is how you stand out. This is how you become very different when you are creating a show or when you are getting on one. Now, last note before we go into actually connecting with the audience and making sure they hear you is this idea of, if you want to start a show, the biggest thing I tell people to do, number one, is go and listen to at least 3 podcasts in your specific area, like ones which would be your direct competitor, even if they're way bigger than you are or think you could be. Listen to them, and you're going to get a sense of how does this person position and how do I want to do it differently. When I started out my first year, I did not do this. Okay. I did not do this. I think in hindsight, there's a lot of strategy that I didn't do, and it really reflected in my downloads. So my first year, I got 10,000 downloads, which is okay for a podcast. And my second year, I got 100,000. And the difference was really understanding this stuff that we're talking about. It's like, how do you position and how do you look at, the different shows? Or if you're a podcast guest, like look at, if you're a nutritionist or a digital marketer, who are some people who are guests that are talking about these things? Because we naturally kind of get scared, right? Like we don't want to necessarily listen to our direct competitor. The insecurities come in sometimes, but it really helps. So if you're going to be a guest, listen to the exact person that has your job, someone else who's doing it. And if you're going to be on a show or start a show, also look at that. I think it's really helpful. So a little like tiny homework, if you want it, would be to think about 3 shows, 3 episodes, even just 5 to 10 minutes that you can listen to figure this out. This is also, you guys are getting kind of like a freebie of this is day 1 of my ready set record challenge. Like literally this is the first action that they do, because it will help give you a lot of grounding. Once you've done that, we move into kind of the big thing here, which is, how do I connect with the audience? Because it's all well and good if you stand out. It's all well and good if you get on the right show or you have a great concept. But if you're not connecting to the listener, and this has been happened to me, I've also had guests like this where it just isn't like resonating. The person's hearing you, but they're just not feeling it. And the first part of that is really alignment, because you want to make sure that what you talk about, values, etc., is so aligned with the listener that you're going to be speaking to, which I know sounds like really obvious, but I'll give you an example. So my show Feel Good Naked, one of the podcasts, is in the fitness and wellness space. And I had a lot of pitches from people who are also in the fitness space, but that's not a value alignment. Just because we're both in the fitness space, or just because we're in marketing, or just because we're both entrepreneurs, does not mean that we are super aligned. And if we're not, that means that either if I'm a guest, the host is not going to want me on the show, or if I get on the show, people might not even really care. They might not download. It might not really stick. And so the alignment is really important. And I had this huge fitness personality. He's like, you've probably seen his ads on YouTube. They're very cringy. He's like a man that focuses specifically on women's fitness, which is a whole nother thing. But anyway, so his agent pitched me, and he has, I don't know, like 15 million YouTube subscribers, millions poured into ads. And they said, we want him on your show. He could talk about XYZ. I don't want this person on my show. Like, it doesn't matter how big they are, because one, his values don't align. He's very much about like pushing women's insecurities, how they don't feel good in their body, therefore they should exercise. I feel like that relationship is reversed. And he was also very like broy, his approach was very like push hard, ignore your body cues, etc. There's no alignment there. And so I know that if I brought him on my show, no one is going to download that. It doesn't matter if all of his people listen either, because they might listen to that one episode and then they're going to see all the other episodes that I have on my show about not dieting, and they're going to walk away because they're going to be like, well, this isn't what I signed up for. So the alignment is really important. And this is why I say that if you are going to be on a podcast, make sure that what you believe is very aligned, or at least respectful of the show host that you're going to be on. And if you are a host or you decide to have a show, be very careful about who you bring on to your show. because it will direct the whole culture of what you do. And also, like, from a business standpoint, it directs your sales and your branding. So alignment is the big piece there. But then the next part of that is going to be, how do I make it so if my values align? So let's say that this guy came on my show and he was all about female confidence and working out to feel strong. And he came on my show. He still might not get a lot of downloads or a lot of interest if he's not really good at connecting to the audience. And this is where storytelling comes in. And this is the part that I truly believe took my show from 10,000 downloads to 100,000 in the second year, was learning how to really carefully structure the way that I spoke when I was on a show or running my own. And this is something you can use for anything you do. So I'll give you a few elements now to think about. But this can go even deeper if we wanted it to. So the first thing is, every single time that I am creating an episode or I'm a guest, I think about, what is the hook? What is the thing that I want to capture someone's attention? So for this session, it was, how can you build your brand through podcasting, even if you have a small following? That's the hook. Like, that's what makes people think, oh, I want to know more. From the hook, I then immediately, like, if you listen to any podcast I've done, I immediately go into the overview briefly of what we'll talk about, but also like what you're going to get, the benefits, and bringing emotions into it from the very beginning. I want you to feel what this episode is going to do for you. And even if you're a guest, you can still frame it that way. When the host asks the first question of, what do? You bring it in and say, I do this, but I'm going to talk about XYZ. And this is how it's really going to change your world. Because people are very low attention rate, right? Even on a podcast. And they want to understand, rightly so, like, why do I even want to listen? Why am I going to even bother here? What is in it for me? Why do I care? And how can the person I'm listening to become human? Not just be another person talking. This is also why I really recommend, like, leading in with your story. When I coach people on creating their podcast, the first episode they ever do, the one that I say send to everyone, is their origin story, showing like the real unfiltered you, the not great, not polished, not PR version of how you started whatever you're doing, and then how it kind of evolved from there. And that makes for such good content when you're connecting with people. It makes for people to just sit there and listen. When I talk about how I spent decades trying to feel good in my body and never feeling like I fit in, and then finally finding this acceptance, that is a lot more interesting than if I say, here are the 7 ways that you can finally, get into your fitness. It doesn't feel the same. Or when I talk about on the business side, when I say I've been an entrepreneur for almost 12 years, but honestly, I probably spent the first 4 to 5 failing. And it took me a really long time to figure out what to do. And I've spent like months where I just had no income trying to figure it out. Like, that is going to be a lot more interesting for you to hear than for me to just immediately jump into the best strategies for everything. So being open about that kind of story on a show, not worrying about being too professional, because at this stage in the marketing world, like, people want realness. And so you don't have to share every like itty bitty gritty detail. Although the more you do podcasting, the more you share. Just like some things I would never share that I share on episode 300, I would not have shared on episode 1. But it's just to give you this sense of, it's okay to not be polished, and it's actually better. And I think too, this is something that can really throw people off, is they get on a show or they run their podcast and what they say doesn't come out the way they want it. And so they like stutter, or they want to edit it out, or they want to repeat it. Just leave that there, like, acknowledge that kind of mistake and just move on. Just keep moving with it, and it will feel so much more comfortable and real to an audience versus you being perfectly polished with perfect pauses. It just isn't as real. I'm going to give you also, I have on my podcast, her first 3 years. Deanna is an amazing episode. Listen to that one. And also, there's a woman called Alea. You can search for it. This is like her thing. It's all about the storytelling. So I would listen to that one because she just really goes into this. And she's such like a raw person speaking. You immediately want to know more. So those are the kind of basics of connecting to the audience: is the hook, the immediate emotions and origin story. And I also like to always have a anecdote for every point that I share. So if I'm going to be talking to you about, for example, alignment, right? Aligning with podcast ideas and podcast shows. I gave you that example, that story of that big YouTuber who wanted to be on my show because it sticks more and people remember stories, not facts. They remember conversations, not being lectured to. So it's very helpful to have these aspects when you're going through. So you've got your hook, you've got your emotions, bringing in the emotions of the person, the benefit to the listener, your kind of raw, real story, an anecdote for each point you make. If you're making 10, you don't need a story for all of them, but I would, not do that many. And then also you want to create the visual. So this is where I said, like, you want to make people feel like they're there in the room with you or in the memory you're calling up, even if they aren't. And this is something that most people don't do very well in general, but like, especially not on podcasting, is can you bring that story, that memory to life? If I'm going to tell you about the day that my mom came in and she told me that she didn't want to do nursing anymore and she wanted to finally be an artist, I'm going to talk to you about how she came in with like paint stained fingers and I could see tears streaking down her cheeks. And she went and she sat on the red sofa, hands on her knees, telling me how she was just done and all she wanted was to have her studio. I'm going to talk about how like we had these conversations and I put on some soft music. I'm going to really bring that story to life because then you are going to remember it and you are going to remember me. And when we tell stories, we often just relay the facts. This happened, then this, and we don't embellish. This, by the way, helps for anything you do, even writing Instagram posts or newsletters. But when you bring in that imagery, it makes you a powerful, powerful podcast guest. It makes you a powerful show host. And it makes people want to come back because the biggest thing that people really love, like honestly, why I think podcasts do so well, even before, people got screen burnout, is because we have this kind of very primal need to be in a storytelling circle, to kind of hear these stories. It's very ingrained in us to do it, but there's not a lot in our world that currently does it. Obviously, like, Netflix does it very well. That's why we spend hours on there. But we don't often do it when we're selling a product or a brand. And the best ones who really do well are able to convey that story and to really make you feel like you are there and like you are experiencing it. So that is the final little bit of when you are thinking about how to connect with the audience. It's the hook, it's the overview, benefits, the emotions. It's a story for every point if you can. It's also about your raw story, like you being very open about where you began in whatever you're talking about. And it's about the imagery, bringing in the senses, the visuals, bringing in all the emotions that you can do. I'm going to go to the questions in a second, guys. So if you do want to add more in there, please do. I see them here. Haven't forgotten you. And so that's how you really connect to the audience. And then the final thing, which I think is probably really challenging and takes work, is you've got to remember how to weave in the right call to action, because you can tell an amazing story on the best podcast in the world and people can love you. But if you haven't given them a really clear next step, then they are going to forget and go on with their day. It's like, how many of us have watched an amazing like movie and we tell people about it a little bit and then we just kind of forget, or a book that changed our lives, but after years we kind of forget. So figuring out too from the very beginning, before you run your podcast episodes, before you go on a show, how can I go in there and what's the like most natural call to action for these people? Like what will really help them? And I am going to mention it at the end of the show, but I also will probably weave it throughout. I'll talk about it a little bit more. So you guys have already noticed here, I've talked about my ready, set, record challenge, because if I'm talking to a group of people who are figuring out, should I have a podcast or not? That's the natural next step. So I weave that into there. If I was talking to people who had a show and they wanted to scale it, I would talk about like one-to-one mentorship. But this is a really key thing because not everything you do is going to be right for every audience. And so understanding what's the right one for me to position in this episode and making sure that I do it. And if you forget for whatever reason, and at the end of that episode, the host has not asked you, be like, hey, can I just quickly mention this? Like, advocate for yourself. We understand as hosts that it is about promoting you as much as it is about promoting our show. So having no fear of doing that will really be what brings someone to you. And the last thing I'll mention on this before I look at the questions is make sure that your call to action is easy. So I wouldn't want to, for example, invite you guys here now to do like my 6-month mentorship with me, because that's not an easy next step. That's not like oh, I heard her, I love it, I'm going to go do it. No, I invited you to a free challenge because it's easy. You sign up, there's nothing extra there. So really think about in your funnel, if you haven't done this yet, what is the top of the funnel? Like, yes, I would love for people to do this one-to-one with me, or I'd love for them to buy this, but realistically, like, where do they need to start? And something that I've told people to do, this can be kind of like a little extra if you want to think about it, is you might need to create the call to action because you might not already have it. You might need to create it specifically for podcasting. So it might be repurposing something you already have, but don't try to take something that already exists and squeeze it into a podcast. Really think about, this is my message. I've got my nook. I know my storytelling. This is the audience I want to go for. And what do they need? And creating it from there. I know it's extra work, but there's a big difference I see in terms of like guests who come back to me and say, hey, I got a client from your show, and those who, I never hear from again. So I'm going to go through the questions if you guys want to ask any here. Let's see if there's anything. Okay, questions.
I didn't know if you found the questions or not, but Lisa, and first off, thank you so much. Like, that was so much great information. And I did not know what Nook was. I didn't know. Let me back it up. I understand the concept of Nook because in digital marketing, it's very similar, but I didn't know the word Nook and what it meant when she's like, oh, and I'm sure Deanna knows this. I'm like, I don't know this.
Well, I didn't know if like you saw it on my stuff or not.
Yeah, then I'm like, okay, all right, that's cool. So thanks for sharing that. So I'm going to get to the questions. Lisa asked, what do you do if the podcast doesn't go well?
So by this, I'm assuming is you start a podcast and no one listens. And that unfortunately is a huge amount of people. So I will never sugarcoat it and say like it's as easy as starting a show and putting it out there. And it's just like Instagram. If you write a post on Instagram, you can't just like pray that it's going to work. It requires some strategy for different stuff. But podcasting is a lot more forgiving in this because listeners are a lot more engaged. So if your show is not going well, I really recommend, and I have a few people who do this too, is rebranding, like relaunching. If you've done it for 6 months, and you should give it 6 months, and you're just not getting any growth. So in terms of growth, I would expect that you are getting between 20 to 30% growth. Well, at least every 3 months, you would be seeing that. And if you're not, then I would say relaunch the show, keeping in mind this stuff, like really looking at this is where we could go like so deep, but really looking at, am I creating a concept that is unique, controversial, stands out in some way? Is it very clear who this concept is for? And are my episodes really targeting what people want and need? Because one of the first things I have people do is I'll have them actually go into, there's a tool called vidIQ, and it looks at what people are searching for on YouTube. And YouTube is the number one source of listening for podcasts actually in the US. So it's a very good indicator of where people's interest is at any time. And I will have people go in and look at, like, okay, you have this idea on branding, but what are people actually asking? What are the questions they want to know? Because the reason why most shows fail is they haven't thought about what the listener wants. They haven't had a real strategy with the guests they bring on, or they're not consistently looking at like what their concept is. It doesn't stand out enough. So I would totally just be honest and say, okay, it's not going well, but I'm going to focus this time and I am going to rebrand it. Because if you've been at it for 6 months and it's not giving you what you want, then you can definitely, redo it and it's okay.
Today, what if the interview isn't going well?
Oh, I've had those. Okay, so this is a little secret. It's your show, and you have the option to not air that episode. And I have had guests where I've told them in the middle of the interview that look like we're not getting to the concept that I know people are wanting. And we were able to turn it around and it was great. And then I've had guests where that didn't happen. And so I don't air that interview. And I'm very honest if they ask about it because it's your show, it's your brand. And ultimately, like if you had they're not employees, but like if you had an employee that wasn't working, you wouldn't keep them on if they're not kind of retraining this way. But I do think a lot of that too is about understanding your listeners and what they want and really doing your background check on guests. So like every guest who comes on my show, I now have someone helping me to source them, but I check every single person, every single one, and always check how they speak as well. That's a really
Yes.
good lesson. You know that one, right? Like I found that out the hard
I had
way.
one. I could relate with one. And that was great
Yeah.
advice because I had often wondered, what if there is an interview? I had one interview that afterwards, I am like, the whole thing felt like a slimy sales pitch, and I didn't like it. I did air it, but I didn't promote it the way I would promote something else. And so I was really curious about that too. It was asked in the questions, but I was glad you answered that. So thank you for
Yeah.
that.
Also editing, right? Like you can, it's your show. You can edit out that stuff. I've taken out people's sales pitches if I felt like they were doing it in a slimy, sleazy way again and
Yes.
again. But I think too, like someone else had asked, how do you turn people down if they're not aligned? And that kind of relates to this as well is you don't have to say yes just because they're your friend, just because they've like commented on your Instagram a bunch of times. I had one lady who I'm not even kidding, like she has been pretty much stalking me for 6 months online, pitching. I don't have to say yes to her, right? Like I can say no. I've said no to her. And you can say no directly and you can say like we're not looking for the guest in your area at this time, or you can send them to a form. And I actually think that that's probably the more professional way to do it is you just have a little Google form with questions and you tell them that that's the next step to get on your show, and then you can kind of just keep it there and maybe one day you want them on or not. And if they ask you again, say like we're not looking for new guests, but I've got your form. And that's probably the more tasteful way to handle it.
That's great. Thank you so much. I have one question. So if you are pitching yourself as to be a guest on a podcast, do you need to have a lead magnet to bring them over to like your website to have them sign up some sort of a freebie? Is it recommended, or what if you don't? What do you do?
I really recommend it because it's kind of like this is your free 45 minutes to an hour for you to be able to talk about what you do and who you are. And it seems like such a wasted opportunity to not have an easy thing for people to do because you might think, well, it's enough for me to say, go to my Instagram or go to my website. But with a website, they don't have any like next call to action, right? And with the Instagram, they might follow you, but they're following 2,000 other people. So it's not, it's important to mention those things, I think, so people can see who you are. But the lead magnet, yes, like in whenever I'm coaching people for this, I say, please have a lead magnet if you're going to be on a podcast, because otherwise you are just kind of missing out.
Awesome. Thank you so much. If anybody else has questions, you can ask them in the chat right now. If you get off or you're watching this on the replay, Sade is inside She Is Collective. You can tag her in the conversations or direct message her right inside the platform, and she'll answer your questions. Sade, one last question. Can we get the link to your free training? So if somebody really wants extra training above this, can we get the link so we can put it inside there? They can join.
Yes. Do you want me to send it to you here or email it to you? How we want to do it? What's best?
Why don't you email it to me and then I
Okay.
will put it inside She Is Collective so everybody can see it, and in the
Mhm.
email as well that they get with the replay. All
Of
right.
course.
Yes, Sade, thank you, thank you, thank you for your time. I appreciate this. And everybody, thank you for attending. We'll see you next time.
Thank you, everyone.